She had always felt invisible, not because she tried to hide, but because the world rarely stopped to notice her. She moved through crowded streets, cafes, and train stations, carrying herself quietly, blending into the rhythm of life around her. People rushed past, glued to their phones, talking loudly, or lost in their own thoughts. She had long grown used to being overlooked, learning that her presence rarely drew attention. But inside her there was a fire, a voice, a gift that she had kept for herself. Music had always been her secret world. Even when no one was listening, she played, softly, passionately, and with a depth that surprised even herself. It was her refuge, the place where she could be herself, completely unguarded. Her fingers had danced across piano keys for years in private, crafting melodies that told stories words could not capture. They spoke of longing, joy, struggle, and quiet triumph. Yet for the most part, her music had been a private affair, locked away in her small apartment, in her mind, and in her heart. On this particular autumn afternoon, the woman found herself sitting in a familiar cafe. It was the kind of place that buzzed with conversations, clinking cups, and the occasional laughter spilling over from nearby tables. She had brought her portable keyboard, an old but reliable instrument she had carried for years. Her plan was simple: play quietly, pass the time, and maybe, if someone noticed, earn a few coins. The cafe was crowded. People sat in groups, engaged in chatter, typing on laptops, scrolling endlessly. Not a single person looked her way. She sighed softly, adjusting her scarf and glancing at the keys. She remembered the countless times she had dreamed of this moment, playing in front of someone who might truly hear her. But the truth was, she had grown used to waiting. The world rarely paused for her. People rarely gave her a second glance. And yet, there was something inside her that refused to stay silent, something that insisted she let her music out, even if only for herself. Taking a deep breath, she positioned her fingers over the keys. The cafe continued its noisy rhythm, cups scraping, chairs moving, conversations rising and falling, and she felt a wave of hesitation. What if no one listened? What if it didn't matter? But then she remembered why she had come. Not for applause, not for recognition, not even for money. She had come for music itself, for the feeling of creating something alive, something that could touch a heart, even just one. She pressed the first key. A single note, soft and clear, resonated through the air. It was gentle, yet there was something about it that made people pause. A few heads turned slightly, not fully committing to attention, but curiosity flickering in their eyes. That one note was the beginning, the spark that would soon grow into something undeniable. Encouraged, she played another note, then another. Slowly, deliberately, she began to weave a melody. It was simple at first, almost tentative, like a whisper, but it carried weight, a subtle emotional pull that demanded to be heard. The melody told a story, though no one knew whose story it was. It spoke of hidden struggles, of quiet hopes, of a longing to be recognized not just for what was seen, but for what was felt. The cafe's atmosphere began to shift imperceptibly. Conversations softened. Laptops closed slightly. People started to look up, drawn in by the sound that seemed to float above the ordinary noise of daily life. There was no shouting, no demand for attention, and only music, raw and honest, filling the room with an invisible presence. For the woman, playing was a revelation. Each note seemed to release a part of herself she had held tightly for years. She could feel her heart aligning with her hands, every movement on the keys a reflection of her soul. The emotions she had bottled up, frustration, loneliness, longing, poured out effortlessly, transforming into melodies that were at once fragile and powerful. The music itself became a bridge, connecting her hidden world to everyone who unknowingly paused to listen. A man sitting near the window stopped mid-sip of his coffee, his eyes widening as the notes reached him. A young woman typing furiously on her laptop slowly lowered her hands, mesmerized by the music. Even the barista behind the counter, used to the hum of the cafe and the background noise of the city, paused to listen, the spoon in her hand suspended in mid-air. It was as if the world had taken a deep breath and was finally paying attention. The woman did not play for recognition, yet she could feel the subtle shift in energy around her. It was not applause, not words of praise, but a quiet acknowledgement that someone or many someones were truly listening. And that was enough. Each note became bolder, more expressive. Her fingers danced faster, yet with grace, creating layers of melody that seemed to tell a story beyond the boundaries of language. She could see faces softened by emotion, Some teary-eyed, others mesmerized, all touched in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Hours seemed to shrink around her. She was both fully herself and completely invisible, a paradox she had known all her life. Yet in that paradox there was a power she had never acknowledged, the power to connect, to move, and to touch hearts with the simplest, purest form of expression. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, she realized that she was no longer invisible. She was seen, not by force or attention-seeking, but because the music demanded it. Her melody grew, expanding with her courage. Each chord, each pause, each delicate trill carried intention and meaning. People in the cafe were leaning forward, caught in the spell of her playing. Even those who had been busy, distracted, or indifferent were now silent, swept away by the sheer honesty of her expression. It was as if the notes themselves had taken life, communicating emotions that no conversation ever could. When she finally reached the final note of her piece, it lingered in the air, soft but resonant. The silence that followed was profound. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. They simply absorbed what they had heard, feeling something profound that had emerged from someone they had never noticed. It was not just music. It was a statement, a revelation, a quiet declaration that she mattered, that her voice in even the smallest, softest note could alter the room. The woman closed her eyes and exhaled. She felt relief, satisfaction, and a quiet triumph. She had come to the cafe to fill time, maybe earn a little money, perhaps find a brief connection. Instead, she had discovered the impact of her own courage, the power of her hidden talent, and the undeniable truth that even someone who felt unseen could create ripples that reached hearts. As the cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm, people lingered longer than usual. Conversations resumed, but with a subtle difference. Strangers smiled at one another, inspired by what they had just experienced. Some approached her quietly, offering kind words and admiration. Others simply left, carrying the memory of a melody that had unexpectedly moved them. And though she remained humble, she could feel a subtle shift within herself, a newfound confidence and the quiet knowledge that her music mattered, that she mattered. She packed up her keyboard, her hands still tingling from the music. Outside, the city moved at its usual hectic pace, but inside her something had changed. The invisible woman who had always felt overlooked had left a mark, however small, on the world around her. She had faced the fear of being unnoticed and discovered that true courage was not loud or demanding, but gentle, persistent, and authentic. And as she walked down the streets, blending into the crowd once more, she carried with her a secret smile. She knew that this was only the beginning, that her music, her courage, and her voice had the power to reach far beyond a single cafe, to touch hearts she had never imagined, and to remind herself and others that no one is truly invisible when they dare to be heard. The cafe had returned to its usual rhythm, but something felt different. People were still talking, still sipping their coffee, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a lingering hum in the air, a quiet awareness that something extraordinary had just happened. The woman had packed up her keyboard, but the memory of her music was alive, resonating in the hearts of those who had listened. She stepped outside into the crisp afternoon, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She felt a strange mix of relief and nervousness. She had shared a piece of herself with the world, but would anyone remember? Would anyone care? She walked slowly down the street, feeling the crunch of fallen leaves beneath her shoes. Each step seemed lighter, as if the music she had played had somehow lifted a weight from her shoulders. In her mind, she replayed the melody, her fingers still moving as if the keys were right in front of her. It had felt so natural, so effortless, and yet she knew it had required courage. Courage she hadn't realized she had until that moment. Back inside the cafe, the small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but a few people lingered. They couldn't stop talking about the woman and the music she had played. One elderly man, who usually spent his afternoons reading quietly, was still staring at the spot where she had sat. He whispered to a friend, "Did you hear that? Did you feel that?" Others nodded, their eyes wide with wonder. Some were moved to tears, others simply sat quietly, absorbing the beauty they had witnessed. It was rare for something so simple, a few notes on a keyboard, to leave such a deep impression. Meanwhile, the woman wandered down quieter streets, thinking about what had just happened. She had never played for anyone outside of her small apartment before. She had always been afraid of judgment, of being laughed at or ignored. But today something had shifted. Today she had taken a risk and it had paid off in ways she couldn't have imagined. The realization brought a small shy smile to her lips. The next morning she returned to the cafe, unsure of what to expect. Would anyone remember her? Would the moment feel as powerful again? Or had it been just a fleeting magical accident? She set up her keyboard in the same corner, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the keys. She took a deep breath and pressed the first note. This time she didn't hesitate. She let the music flow naturally, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Almost immediately, heads turned. People who had come in for coffee and quiet conversation were drawn to the melody. The woman's music filled the space, weaving through the air like a thread of gold. Each note carried emotion, telling a story of longing, hope, and quiet strength. People stopped mid-conversation, their eyes fixed on her, their attention fully captured. The invisible woman was no longer invisible. She was commanding the room without saying a word. A young man who had been typing on his laptop paused and whispered to his friend, "Who is she? She's amazing." Another person, a woman with a small child, smiled and nudged her companion. "I've never heard anything like this in my life." The comments were quiet, almost reluctant, as if people were afraid to break the spell. But the reactions were undeniable. Something extraordinary was happening, something that could not be ignored. The woman played for hours, lost in the music. She didn't notice the people gathering around her, forming a small circle of listeners. Some were strangers who had been drawn in by curiosity. Others were regular patrons who had come to see if the magic was real. She played with all the emotion she had kept hidden for years, letting the music speak where words could not. Each note seemed to carry a piece of her soul, reaching into the hearts of those who listened. By late afternoon, the cafe was filled with people who had come specifically to hear her. Some had even returned after leaving earlier, unable to resist the pull of the music. The energy in the room was electric yet gentle, a shared experience that transcended age, background, and language. It was as if the music had created a small, temporary world where everyone was connected, united by something pure and beautiful. Among the crowd was a man who did not belong to the cafe. He had walked in quietly, observing the scene from a distance. He was a music producer, someone whose work required an ear for talent and an instinct for discovery. He had been walking by when the first notes reached him, and something inside him had stopped. He had followed the sound, and now he watched, captivated as the woman poured her heart into every key. He had seen many performers, many musicians, but something about her was different. There was authenticity, raw emotion, and undeniable skill. He knew instantly that this was a rare talent. The producer approached the woman cautiously, not wanting to interrupt her flow. When she finally took a pause and looked up, he smiled and said, "That was incredible. Have you ever thought about sharing your music with a larger audience?" The question startled her. She had never imagined that her quiet playing in a cafe could lead to anything beyond that small room. She shook her head, unsure of what to say. He continued, "You have something special. People don't just hear you, they feel you. I'd love to help you record your music, to bring it to more people who need to hear it." The woman hesitated, the old fear of being noticed creeping in. What if she failed? What if people didn't like her music? But as she looked around the cafe, at the faces of people moved by her playing, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was time to take the next step, to let the world see and hear what she had kept hidden for so long. Over the next few days, she met with the producer. They discussed songs, melodies, and the emotions she wanted to convey. For the first time, she felt her talent being taken seriously, not just as a hobby, but as something meaningful. The process was slow, sometimes intimidating, but it was also exhilarating. She was learning that her music had power, that it could touch lives far beyond a cafe, and that her voice, quiet and humble though it was, mattered. Word about her performance in the cafe began to spread. Social media posts, shared videos, and personal stories of those who had been there created a small buzz. People who had ignored her presence before were now curious, eager to witness the magic themselves. Invitations for small performances started coming in, followed by opportunities to collaborate with other musicians. She was careful not to rush, savoring each step, learning to balance humility with newfound recognition. Even as opportunities grew, she never lost the quiet, reflective side of herself. She still walked the streets unnoticed at times, still enjoyed moments of solitude, and still found joy in playing music for the simple pleasure of it. But now there was a difference. She understood that the same music that had been her private sanctuary could also connect her with the world, inspire others, and bring people together in unexpected ways. Her life began to change slowly but profoundly. The woman who had once been invisible was now becoming known for her talent, but she remained grounded. She didn't seek fame or attention. She wanted her music to matter, to carry emotion and truth to anyone willing to listen. And every time she played, she remembered that first note, the one that had shifted everything, that had made the world pause and finally pay attention. By the end of the week, she returned to the cafe, her first place of discovery. She set up her keyboard in the same corner, and as she played, she noticed something remarkable. The people who had heard her before smiled, recognizing her presence. New listeners came, drawn by the stories they had heard, eager to experience the music firsthand. The cafe had become a small sanctuary where her music could be felt, where hearts could be touched, and where the invisible woman was no longer invisible. Her melodies had begun to form a bridge, a connection between her world and the world outside. People who had once ignored her were now listening with intent, moved by something intangible yet deeply real. It was more than just notes on a keyboard. It was her courage, her truth, and her vulnerability translated into sound. And with every passing day, she felt stronger, more confident, and more willing to share the rest of her talent with the world. By the time she packed up her keyboard that evening, she realized how much had changed in just a few days. The invisible woman had begun to emerge slowly but surely through her music. She had discovered that sharing her gift was not about recognition, applause, or money. It was about courage, connection, and the joy of expressing her authentic self. And she knew, deep in her heart, that this was only the beginning of a journey that could touch far more lives than she had ever imagined. The following week was a whirlwind for the woman, though she hardly realized it at first. She had never experienced anything like it. Meetings, rehearsals, and discussions about her music filled her days. Each encounter was new, exciting, and slightly terrifying. She had spent so long being invisible that suddenly being seen felt overwhelming yet thrilling. The producer had been patient, encouraging, and professional, helping her navigate a world she had only imagined in her dreams. Her first recording session took place in a small studio. The walls were lined with soundproof panels. Microphones hung from stands, and monitors displayed levels and settings she didn't fully understand. The woman stood nervously in front of the keyboard, her hands hovering over the keys. The producer smiled at her from behind the glass, giving a reassuring nod. "Take a deep breath. Remember why you're here. Play like you do when no one is watching." For a moment she hesitated, her heart pounding. Memories of the cafe flooded back. The first note, the silence that followed, the way people had stopped and listened. That memory gave her courage. She pressed a key, softly at first, then allowed the melody to flow naturally. The studio seemed to shrink around her as she lost herself in the music. Every note carried emotion, longing, hope, vulnerability, and quiet strength. The producer listened, completely absorbed. He had recorded many talented musicians, but there was something different about her. She wasn't playing to impress. She was playing because it was an extension of herself. He made a few technical adjustments here and there, but he let her lead the session. Her music was alive, and no amount of editing could replicate the raw honesty she brought to each note. Hours passed unnoticed. The woman played, stopping only briefly to adjust a chord or take a sip of water. When they finally played back the recording, the sound filled the room. It was richer than she had imagined. Every nuance of her performance captured, every emotion preserved. She listened in awe, barely able to believe that this was her music, now shared in a form that could reach the world. The producer clapped softly, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "This is amazing. People will feel every note, every emotion. This is just the beginning." The woman smiled, a mix of relief, pride, and disbelief washing over her. She had dreamed of this moment for years, and now it was real. But beneath the excitement was a quiet fear. The fear of judgment, of failing, of being exposed to a world that hadn't seen her before. Despite her nerves, she agreed to record more songs over the following days. Each session was a discovery, not just of her music, but of herself. She learned to trust her instincts, to embrace mistakes as part of the creative process. and to let her emotions guide her fingers across the keys. The music she had once kept hidden in the solitude of her apartment was now becoming something tangible, something that could touch countless lives. Meanwhile, word about her cafe performance and her recordings began to spread. Social media posts, shares, and videos created a growing buzz. People who had been moved by her music posted clips, describing how it had made them feel, how it had given them hope or simply lifted their spirits. The comments poured in, strangers thanking her, praising her talent, and asking where they could hear more. She read them quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes tearing up. She had never imagined that her private music could have such an impact. A small local radio station invited her to perform live on air. The invitation frightened her at first. The thought of playing in front of microphones, cameras, and an audience far larger than the cafe was intimidating. But she remembered the first moment she had played for strangers and how it had felt to connect through music. That memory became her anchor. She agreed, determined to let her music speak for itself. On the day of the radio performance, she arrived early. The studio buzzed with activity, technicians checking equipment, producers giving instructions, and a host preparing to introduce her. She set up her keyboard and took a moment to breathe. Then, as she pressed the first key, the world faded away. The music carried her beyond the studio walls, reaching listeners she could not see, but who could feel every note. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Callers flooded the station with messages of admiration and thanks. Listeners shared their personal stories, explaining how the music had touched them in ways they couldn't describe. Some spoke of difficult times, loneliness, or moments of despair, and how her melodies had provided comfort and hope. The woman listened quietly, astonished at the impact of something she had once believed was only hers to enjoy. Her confidence grew with each performance, both in the studio and live. Invitations arrived for small concerts, charity events, and collaborative projects with other musicians. People wanted to work with her, not because she sought fame, but because her music carried authenticity and emotion that resonated universally. She began to see that being noticed was not about showing off or competing, but about sharing a gift that had the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Despite the growing attention, she remained humble. She continued to play in the cafe occasionally, returning to the place where it all began. There she felt grounded, reminded of the quiet courage that had started everything. She understood now that her talent was not defined by recognition, but by the emotion and sincerity she put into every note. And yet, seeing the faces of people moved by her music, watching strangers pause to listen, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. As her reputation grew, she also began mentoring others. She met young musicians, shy and unsure like she had once been, and encouraged them to play from the heart. She shared her journey, the fear, the risk, the magic of being heard, and helped others discover that courage and authenticity could carry them far beyond their comfort zones. She became not only a performer but a guide, showing that talent combined with heart could truly make a difference. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals and interviews, she sat by her window reflecting on how much had changed. Just a few weeks ago, she had been invisible, moving quietly through life, believing her music mattered only to herself. Now, her melodies reached thousands of people, and she had discovered a world she never imagined. Yet in the midst of fame and recognition, she remained the same person, quiet, reflective, and deeply committed to the music that had always defined her. She understood something important. Being seen was not the goal. The goal was connection. Every note she played, every melody she shared, was a thread that linked her to others, reminding them, and in herself, that even the quietest voices can create ripples that touch lives in profound ways. She had learned that courage is not loud. It is persistent, gentle, and rooted in truth. And music, when played with honesty, has the power to change not just a moment, but a life. Her journey was far from over. The world was vast, and there were still many stages to play, many hearts to touch, and countless melodies waiting to be discovered. She had started as a woman who felt invisible, but now she was a musician, a storyteller, and a beacon for anyone who had ever doubted the value of their own voice. Each performance reminded her that the first step, pressing that first note, taking that first risk, had been the most important. From there, everything else had followed, unfolding naturally, beautifully, and unexpectedly. By the end of part 3, the woman was no longer just a quiet figure in a cafe. She had become a symbol of courage, authenticity, and the power of music to unite people. Her talent was undeniable, but what made her story extraordinary was not just skill, it was heart. The world had finally noticed her, not because she demanded attention, but because she dared to share herself fully, and in doing so reminded everyone that every voice, no matter how quiet, deserves to be heard.